Hey, it's Sunday. Thought I would give you a nice little sloth hello. See? So, what I want to talk about right now is stacking the first fundamental. This isn't going to be particularly exciting because we're not getting into welding. Sorry, that comes later. First thing we want to talk about is grinding nibs. The reason we want to talk about that, first of all, is if you can't grind a nib, stacking it is useless. So, let's talk about what I consider to be the absolute primary grind you need to understand for doing layered nibs. And that is the Architect. And I can learn to spell sometimes. Anyway, the Architect nib, as a lot of you probably know already, is when you shave off the front of a nib so that your side-to-side lines are wider than your up and downs. So you get nice block letters like you typically see with Architect handwriting, right? Super. So we've got this. Now, since we're talking about grinding nibs, the first thing I want to bring up is how you start. My point of view is don't buy machines first. Why? The machines you want to buy, a Fordham SR, which is a hanging Dremel. They often use them for jewelry work. Foot pedal powered, or I should say foot pedal adjusted speed. They're fabulous. They're a little expensive for when you're just starting out learning things. You'll see a lot of nib grinders and nib meisters use Fordham bench lathe, which is this lovely little motor with thingies out on the end that you put burrs and polishing bobs on. You can get Dremels and use Dremels. You can get Proxon micromotors. They're great too. You can buy cut rate versions of Fordhams, and that's fine. But still, that's an outlay of money because once you get your micromotor or your Fordham, you're spending X amount of dollars on grinding bits, polishing bits, sanding bits that you don't really need to spend right up front. So let's do this on the cheap before we get into doing stuff that costs significant money. Speaking of cheap, don't buy Bach or Yowo nibs, or use gold nibs to start with when you begin doing grindings. It's a simple reason. If you take the tipping off, you just lost a minimum of $20. That makes no sense. Just like spending a buku of money on a Fordham. Let's start with cheap, okay? AliExpress or eBay. Buy a ton of Jinhao number 6s. They're affordable. Affordable is actually, they're dirt cheap. The metal's not great. I don't know what the tipping material is, but that doesn't matter. This is a fine or a medium, depending on who you ask. If you can do a grind on something this small, you're going to be fantastic when you've got a stacked nib that you're working on. So, next thing, since we're establishing Jinhaos, always when you start off. Since I was saying don't buy a grinding machine, you're probably asking yourself, well, Jim, what the hell do I do then? Easy. 1000 grit sandpaper. You can buy this at your favorite automotive parts store in the paint and finishing section. You could start with 600. You can get that at Home Depot or Lowe's or some local hardware store. If you're doing sandpaper and you decided to start with 600, say, do 600, 1,000, 2,000 or 2,500, 3,000, 4,000, and maybe 6. That's a decent toolkit. Because once you've got a primary grind done, you like how it is, it's even, you want to polish it up, so you go up grits from that primary grind, whether it was 600 or 1,000. Now, if you want to do it a little faster, I don't necessarily recommend it, but you can do it. Since you're already on AliExpress or eBay or wherever you might buy these ridiculously cheap, DHgate, I don't know, scoot over into the knife sharpener section, buy 1,000 grit diamond sharpening plate, maybe a 2,000, maybe a 3,000. You can do everything that you would do with the sandpaper on this a little bit faster. Okay, caveat. The faster you move, the more tipping material you move, the more likely it is you're going to get it. I'm not going to say necessarily wrong because you'll learn something, but you're not necessarily going to get the effect you want. So, that being said, let's look at the architect grind a little more. I like drawing things. My background's in fine art. It's easier to show you this than to get down and go scritchy, scritchy, scritchy on a piece of sandpaper. It just saves time, money, and space. So, like I was saying, your architect grind is shaving off the front of the ball of the tipping material. That's great. You can start by just shaving it down. That's wonderful. But the real fun, this is really not to scale for the front of a nib, I apologize. You've got your tipping material down here. Normally, you'd have that lovely little teardrop ball. With an architect, depending on how you shave it out, you've got an angle. This is great. Whatever this angle is and wherever these meet controls the width of that downstroke. Makes perfect sense. It also gives you a very distinct sweet spot. If you get this off, let's say, you're going to get scratchiness. And you'll be polishing the tip forever trying to equalize it. My suggestion is when you do the sanding, go for a curve instead. All that means is when you've got your nib side against the sanding material, instead of just going back and forth this way, which will take off an angle, do a motion like that. The sweeping motion will round these sides. What that does is it eliminates that super fine sweet spot. You can still edit, the width of the tip. That's easy. You just change the angle that your sweeping motion is at. Okay? Makes perfect sense. Once you get this to this point, go back in with a similar motion like this for smoothing with a higher grit sandpaper or a higher grit diamond stone, whichever you're using. The architect grind is kind of interesting and fun because you're holding the nib on a couple of different axes at the same time. You've got it canted upwards, and you've also got it at an angle because you're shaving off in this direction, or rather that direction, to get here. Secret, you can actually do that while you're doing this. Instead of shaving that off, in the beginning, all that you do is hold it at this angle, and instead of, again, a very hard angle, just roll it. Because eventually, you're going to get down to that sharp ridge, then smooth it off. Another significant trick is this. If you've got a Jinhao hardware and feed laying around, chuck your nib in this while you're doing your sanding or grinding. Why? It stabilizes it. Jinhao nibs are fairly flexible, cheap steel. I can't tell you what grade it is. All I know is that it's a stainless. If this is stable and you're moving slow, you have less chance of grinding the other side while you're doing the side you're working on. This is actually something I'd suggest you do with a Bach or a Yowo. Saves you a little time, a little less hassle, and could give you better results right up front. So the reason this is important is when you're doing stacked nibs, let's just do a basic 2-layer drawing here. Where you're going from there is something like that. Now, that bit I'll talk about later. As my friend Damien from All in the Nib said, there's a lot more going on in this than I thought there was. Yeah, there is. And that's what makes doing stacked nibs alternately a fabulous thing and alternately a complete pain in the rear. So, you're taking off or sanding down those two balls. Why? You want to equalize this, otherwise you're drawing two lines at once, or your lockup between the nib tips isn't good. What that means is if there's no capillary action between the nib against the feed and the nib section above it, you're not going to get any ink there. Which means all you'll do is write down here. And when you do the thing that stacked nibs are famous for, which is line variation, this isn't going to do you any good. Okay, so that's why you want to start with architect grinds, because if you can do that, you're moving in the direction where you'll get some better results once you start stacking nibs. Again, when you start attaching things to other things, don't start with boxer Jinhaos, or rather boxer Yowos. Go back to your Jinhaos and wreck them. You'll feel better, you'll waste less money, and you're kind of free to do what you want without huge consequences. In my opinion, that's worth waiting 2 months for 200 nibs from China. So, this was Stacking Nibs Fundamental 01, grinding the architect grind, which is where you'll start off and leads to almost anything you want to do. Also keep in mind, reverse architect. Think about that. It'll come in handy too. It's the same general process, except you're going this way on the tipping ball rather than this way. Keep that in the back of your head. It's important for later. So, thanks a lot for watching. I hope you got something out of this. If you've got questions, leave them in the comments. Check out my Instagram feed. It's @PenSloth. No real surprise there. Thanks a lot. Have a good day. Buy some Jinho Nibs.